Hello, welcome to the session Defining Methods. So with defining methods, we'll talk about the method declaration first. This is an example of a method that I will use to walk us through the method declaration. So let me just switch back to our IntelliJ IDEA, and then I'll show you the method that I selected to use for the example, this one here. So it's a public void set password. The parameter is string password, and what's the body is we are setting the password to password. If you do not have this, we did this in the previous session. There's a link in the description with the exact same code in case you skip the session. So you could have this code with you too for the previous session. But I'll also make a point of setting the card up, so you can just click on it and fetch the link from there. So this is the method that I will use to walk us through the method declaration. Switching back to the whiteboard. So the very first bit of the method declaration is the modifier. We already looked at modifiers, public, private, when we were discussing the fields, okay? Fields as class members. So we have the modifier, could be public or private, but we'll talk more about that, as I had said in a previous session. Then we have the return type. This is required. So the modifier is optional, but the return type is required. The return type needs, well, we'll talk more about this in the next session. It could be a data type or void if that method does not return anything. We saw this in one of the methods earlier, and I'll walk us through a demo shortly. Then the method name comes next. So this is, we'll also discuss some more about this and the naming convention. Then we have the parameters within the parentheses. So this is also required. Then the curly braces, also required. Then the method body within the curly braces. Okay, so this one right here is the method declaration in Java. So let's walk through the bits and pieces, starting with the return type. Now, the return type can be the data type returned by the method. I'll demonstrate this because sometimes we would need our methods or our functions or our behaviors to return something, and we'll see a very simple example of this. But if a method doesn't return a value, you have to use void because the return type is required for method declaration. So let me just walk us through a method that returns something. So this is a very simple example. We have defining methods. Let's say we are working with code and we need to work with a method that returns summation of some values. So let's do this. I'll say public. We want it to return summation of some values, and those values are integers. So the return type will be int. Then I'll give the method the name, returns. What does it do? It returns sum. Then the parentheses, then the curly braces. Then within here, I'll need to put my method body. Now I'd like to take your attention to this error here in red. It lets me know that I need to have a return statement. If a method has a return type, it needs to have a return statement. If it has a return data type, sorry, because all of them have return types. Void if none, if it doesn't return a data type specifically. So in that case, this method needs to have a return type. It needs to return something. So assuming we have some values already from within our code, this is where we'd maybe sum them up and set them in a variable, and then we return that. But for the sake of the demo, let me just return directly, say 2 + 2, and that should be that. But this is very simplified. We'll see more about this. I just wanted to make a point that this is what we would expect to happen if a method has a return type, but we will see more about that as we move along. For now, we are walking through the basics. Okay, then if it returns nothing, then we work with void. And I'll just work with the main method. That is where we started in our hello world, because I want us to see the statement I made when we were discussing hello world about how we're going to go through the bits and pieces of that code. With time, the concepts will sink in, I want to go back to that, the most common method and the first intro to methods in Java that we had in the previous session. So public static void, if you missed the session, I typed in main and then I selected on that. Let me just do that again in case you missed it. You type in main, then you enter, and the public static void main method will be put in for us. So we have void here to say that the method doesn't need to return anything. So this is why we don't see the error we saw earlier that indicated that you needed to have a return type. Then you can also have your own, public void, say set name, for example, or get name, could be anything. There you go. So there's no error here because it doesn't expect a return type. The return type is marked as void. So going back to our demo, our whiteboard rather, sorry. Here we go. So yeah, that's about the return type. It could either be a data type depending on what the method is doing, or void if it does not return anything. 3 is the method name. So in Java, conventionally, a method name should be a verb. Okay, get, set, fetch, connect, disconnect, etc. Or if it's multi-worded, it should start with a verb and the preceding words should be in lower camel case. For example, disconnect database. So the disconnect is verb, database is a noun. So whatever follows more often than not is either an adjective or a noun and so on. But the naming convention are you start with lowercase verb, then you proceed on. So we call this lower camel case. Let me just show you that more about what we had earlier from our database method. Observe. This is a method, get password. Naming convention, get the verb, password the noun. Set password, set the verb, password the noun. Connect, it's just a verb, it's one word. Disconnect, still a verb, one word. Execute query, nice example. The verb and the noun and so on. So those are the naming conventions. Again, just to demonstrate, public is not required, the modifier is not required. So if I delete that, nothing changes. However, the data type is required. So if I mess with that, there will be an error as expected. The name is required. If I remove this, there's going to be an error. Parentheses are required. If I remove this, there's going to be an error. Curly braces required. If I remove the curly braces, there's going to be an error. Okay, so just take note of that in the whiteboard. Anywhere where I indicated is required is indeed required. Then to future topic. So once in one of the sessions, we'll talk about exceptions in Java, and you'll get to see how exceptions are also part of the method declaration in some instances. So stay tuned for that. Just leave it as it is right now. Let's just keep it simple, work with what we've seen already. But when you get to exceptions, you'll understand how they will also be part of the method declaration in some instances at that point. Let me just do that. So another thing in defining methods, we were talking about the method signature. So we've seen the method declaration, the modifier, this one right here. Let me just go back to it to set it apart for all of us. This is the method declaration. It has the modifier. It has the return type, it has the name, it has the parentheses with its parameters, and it has the curly braces, and inside it there is the code, right? That's the method declaration, still under defining methods. Another thing under defining methods is the method signature. Okay, so what makes up a method signature in Java? It's the method name and the parentheses with its parameters. So set password and string password. This entire block here is the method signature. So the compiler uses the method signature to tell different methods apart, to know that this method is different from this method. Because of that, you cannot have similar method signature from within the same file. the same class or the same, the same related block of code, as I will demonstrate shortly. So you will see an error. If you try to have the same method signature twice, you will see an error. Why? The compiler uses the signature to tell methods apart. So if they are similar, then the compiler cannot tell them apart, and hence the error. So please note, because of that, you could sometimes have methods with the same name, but as long as the parentheses content is not the same, then they don't have the same signature. When this happens, it's called method overloading. They have the same name, but they have different signatures, and I will demonstrate that. So let's go and look into that. So we're talking about method signature. I'll just go to this original example about our database. Let's say I want to have another method by the name disconnect. So within the same class, if I was to type disconnect as such, and in fact, even before I finish with the parentheses and everything, it's already letting me know something is wrong here. So this one is an error, okay? Disconnect is already defined, the definition, right? So you cannot have that. You cannot have that. However, you can have the same method or method name as long as the parameters are different. For example, I can have void connects, even though I have another method by the same name. This is called method overloading. Sometimes you'd find it necessary, but don't overdo it, because if you overdo it, your code will not be very readable. So sometimes this is necessary to have the same method name, and I'm about to show us what instances, example instances can those be. So this method has a different definition from this, although it has the same name. The name and the parameters are what make the method definition. So please note this signature, the method signature, so this signature is different from this signature, and because of that, the same methods with the same name can exist. Okay, so sometimes again, you might need to have the same method names, similar method names within your file. In that case, this is method overloading, where we have methods of the same name but different definition. So for example, let's say you're coming up with a class for data artists, and you need to separate their calligraphies of various data types, and you're handling that using different data types. So this is calligraphy for string, calligraphy for int, calligraphy for double, calligraphy for int and double, and so on. So you might find that in such an instance, you just prefer to work with the name draw instead of draw string, draw integer, draw double, and so on. So this could be acceptable in that instance where you're trying to avoid clumsiness in your code. So you just work with the draw as long as the signatures are different. However, if this is overdone, the method, your code will not be very readable. I'll be sharing this link. It's from my GitHub. Again, the finished code. Make sure you look at the source. This is the source, the original Java documentation. It will tell you more about overloading and what I've just walked us through. So what have we done then in this session? What we've done is we've looked at defining methods with method signature and method declaration. See you on the next one.